Spring of 1945, somewhere in rural Kansas. A United States Army Staff Sergeant named Lloyd Thompson stood outside a roadside establishment, the warm evening air carrying the sound of laughter and music from inside. He had traveled over 8,000 kilometers from the battlefields of Europe, survived countless dangers, and now found himself barred from entering a civilian establishment on American soil. The reason was not his service record, nor his conduct, but the color of his skin. Inside that same establishment, dozens of German prisoners of war sat drinking, laughing, and enjoying privileges that Thompson himself was denied. He believed this moment would end in humiliation and defeat. Just another chapter in a long story of injustice he had learned to endure. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Lloyd Thompson chose to do in the hours that followed would not only transform the lives of everyone inside that establishment, but would become a quiet turning point that revealed the profound contradictions of a nation at conflict abroad while battling its own demons at home. This is the story of how one man's dignity in the face of humiliation would create ripples that spread far beyond that single Kansas evening. Lloyd Thompson had enlisted in 1942, joining the segregated units of the United States Army with a mixture of patriotism and pragmatism. Born in Atlanta, Georgia in 1918, he had grown up understanding the unwritten rules that governed his existence. He knew which water fountains to use, which sections of the bus to sit in, which streets to walk down after dark. The military offered him something beyond the cotton fields and limited opportunities of Depression-era Georgia, a chance to prove himself, to learn skills, to see a world beyond the narrow confines of segregation. He had been assigned to the 664th Quartermaster Truck Company, one of the many segregated service units that kept the machinery of conflict functioning. While white infantry units received glory and recognition, Thompson and his fellow soldiers drove supply trucks across treacherous terrain, maintained equipment in freezing conditions, and worked 20-hour shifts to ensure ammunition, food, and medical supplies reached the front lines. They called themselves the Red Ball Express, and they moved over 400,000 tons of supplies in less than 3 months during the push through France. Thompson had driven his 2.5-ton truck through destroyed French villages, past burned-out German vehicles, through roads cratered by artillery. He had seen the desperation in French civilian eyes, the exhaustion of American infantry, the vacant stares of German prisoners being marched to the rear. He had maintained his vehicle with spare parts scavenged from wrecks, had navigated by starlight when blackout conditions prevented the use of headlights, had stayed awake for 36 continuous hours because the infantry needed ammunition and there was no one else to deliver it. He carried shrapnel scars on his left shoulder from when his convoy had been caught in an artillery barrage outside St. Lo. He had pulled 2 wounded drivers from their burning trucks, had applied tourniquets with hands shaking from adrenaline and terror, had driven through the smoke and chaos to get them to a field hospital. For this he had received no medal, no commendation, just a field dressing for his own wounds and orders to return to duty within 48 hours. The journey to this moment had been long and complex. Thompson's military service had begun in the segregated training camps of the American South, where colored recruits were housed separately, trained separately, and constantly reminded of their subordinate status, even as they prepared to serve their country. The officers were almost exclusively white, many from southern states where racial hierarchies were most rigidly enforced. Some were fair-minded men who judged soldiers by their performance. Others brought their prejudices with them and wielded their authority in ways that reinforced racial divisions. Thompson had excelled in training despite these obstacles. His mechanical aptitude, honed through years of helping his father repair farm equipment in Georgia, made him valuable in the motor pool. He learned to diagnose engine problems by sound, to repair transmissions with limited tools, to keep vehicles running under conditions that would have defeated less resourceful mechanics. His superiors recognized his skills, even if they did not always acknowledge them publicly, and he advanced through the ranks based on sheer competence and determination. The transition to overseas deployment had been jarring in unexpected ways. In England, where American forces prepared for the invasion of France, Thompson and his fellow colored soldiers encountered a civilian population that did not share American racial attitudes. British people invited colored soldiers into their homes, served them in pubs and restaurants, treated them as guests and allies rather than as inferiors. For many colored soldiers, this was their first experience of being treated as equals by white people, and it was simultaneously liberating and deeply sad, highlighting how different things could be and how unnecessarily cruel American segregation truly was. This contrast created tensions with white American soldiers, some of whom resented British acceptance of colored troops. There were incidents and conflicts, unofficial but real, as white soldiers attempted to export American racial hierarchies to British soil. The British, to their credit, generally resisted these efforts, though the presence of hundreds of thousands of American troops gave American military authorities considerable influence. Thompson had witnessed a particularly telling incident in a small English village. A white American soldier had told a pub owner not to serve colored troops, claiming they were unreliable and dangerous. The pub owner, a veteran of the previous global conflict, had responded by asking about Thompson's service record. Upon learning of Thompson's technical skills and his unit's crucial role in keeping supply lines functioning, the pub owner had ordered the white soldier to leave and invited Thompson and his companions to stay as honored guests. That evening, sharing beer and conversation with British civilians who saw him simply as an American soldier rather than as a colored American soldier, Thompson had glimpsed what equality might feel like. He had also felt a deepening anger at the American system that made such simple human dignity seem revolutionary. When he eventually returned to American soil, the contrast would be even sharper, the injustice even more glaring. Now, in the spring of '45, Thompson found himself stateside on a brief rotation leave before expected deployment to the Pacific Theater. The conflict in Europe was clearly winding down, but Japan remained defiant, and everyone knew the invasion of the home islands would require every available soldier. Thompson had 30 days of leave to visit family, rest, and prepare himself for what promised to be even more intense combat than he had experienced in Europe. He had been traveling by bus from Georgia back to his training camp in Kansas, a journey that required him to sit in the back, to use separate facilities at rest stops, to endure the small daily humiliations that reminded him of his place in the social order. After 2 days of travel, hungry and exhausted, he had gotten off at a small town outside Fort Riley, hoping to find a meal before the final leg of his journey. The establishment was called Johnny's Roadhouse, a simple wooden structure with a gravel parking lot and a flickering neon sign. Through the windows, Thompson could see it was crowded, filled with men in military uniforms. He approached the entrance, his stomach growling, his travel pay burning a small hole in his pocket. The owner, a thick-set man named Johnny Garrison, met him at the door before Thompson could even reach for the handle. "We don't serve your kind here," Garrison said, his voice matter-of-fact, as if he were simply stating operating hours or menu prices. Thompson felt the familiar weight settle in his chest, that heavy resignation that came from a lifetime of such moments. He looked past Garrison into the establishment, seeing the crowded tables, the men drinking beer and eating plates of food. "I'm a soldier," Thompson said quietly, hoping against experience that the uniform might matter more than his skin. "I've been traveling for 2 days, I just want a meal." Garrison shook his head, actually looking somewhat apologetic, as if he regretted the policy but could not imagine changing it. "Look, I got nothing against you personally," he said, "but this is how things are. I got a business to run, and my regular customers wouldn't appreciate it. You understand?" Thompson understood perfectly. He understood that his service meant nothing, that his scars meant nothing, that the miles he had driven and the dangers he had faced meant nothing in the face of a skin color he had no control over. Then Thompson noticed something that made his stomach turn. At the tables near the windows, he could see prisoners of war. German prisoners wearing their distinctive uniforms with PW tags clearly visible, sitting among American civilians and soldiers, eating, drinking, laughing. They had been transported to camps throughout the American Midwest and put to work in agriculture and labor projects. Many were young men who had been captured in North Africa or Italy or France, career soldiers who had believed in causes Thompson found abhorrent, who had taken up arms against everything America claimed to stand for. And they were welcome here, while he was not. "Those men," Thompson said, pointing through the window, "they can eat here?" Garrison followed his gesture and shrugged. "They're prisoners," he said. "They're supervised. They work the local farms, and they got money to spend. Like I said, it's just business." Thompson felt anger rising in his throat, hot and bitter, but he forced it down. Decades of survival had taught him that expressing anger in such situations only made things worse. He stepped back from the doorway, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, and Garrison closed the door. As Thompson sat on the bench outside Johnny's roadhouse, his mind wandered through the landscape of his experiences. He thought about specific moments that had shaped his understanding of his position in American society. He remembered being 7 years old, watching his father step off a sidewalk to let white people pass, seeing the forced smile his father wore to appear unthreatening, learning the survival skills that colored people had to master. He remembered his mother's lessons about dignity and pride, how she insisted that external treatment could not determine internal worth, that maintaining self-respect was a form of resistance. She had told him stories of their ancestors, some who had been enslaved, others who had fought for freedom in various wars, all who had survived and persisted and passed down their strength to the next generation. He thought about his decision to enlist, made against his mother's fears and his father's reservations. They had worried about sending him into danger, but they had also worried about what military service in a segregated system would do to his spirit. Would it break him or strengthen him? Would he return angry and broken or determined and hopeful? Thompson believed now that the answer was both. The military had shown him the worst of American prejudice, but it had also given him skills, confidence, and connections with other men who shared his experiences. It had taken him across an ocean, shown him different ways of organizing society, proven to him that American racial attitudes were not universal or inevitable. The segregation he endured was not accidental or incidental. It was systematic and intentional, built into military structure, through deliberate policy decisions made at the highest levels. Colored units were designated for support roles rather than combat positions, based on theories of racial inferiority that had no scientific basis, but served the purposes of those who wanted to maintain white supremacy. Even when colored units proved themselves in combat, as some had done despite being relegated to support duties, their achievements were often minimized or credited to white officers. Thompson had read extensively during his downtime, educating himself about the history of colored Americans in military service. He knew about the Buffalo Soldiers who had served on the frontier, about the Harlem Hellfighters of the previous global conflict, about the countless unnamed soldiers who had served with distinction in every American conflict since the Revolution. Their service had never been enough to guarantee equality, but it had accumulated into an undeniable record that undermined racist ideology. The current conflict was different in scale and scope from anything previous. Millions of colored Americans were serving in segregated units but in enormous numbers, performing crucial roles that kept the military machine functioning. They were proving, on a massive scale, that racist assumptions about their capabilities were false. The question was whether this proof would be sufficient to force change, or whether it would be ignored and rationalized away as previous service had been. Thompson was determined to ensure that this service was documented and remembered. He kept detailed personal records, encouraged other soldiers to do the same, and sent reports to civil rights organizations that were already planning post-conflict campaigns for equality. He understood that documentation was a form of warfare, that creating an undeniable historical record was essential for future battles over rights and recognition. For a long moment, Thompson stood in the gravel parking lot, listening to the sounds of conversation and laughter from inside. He could smell cooking food, could hear the clink of glasses and plates. His hunger had transformed into something else now, a hollow ache that food could not fill. He walked to a wooden bench outside the establishment and sat down. The spring evening was pleasant, warm but not hot, with a gentle breeze carrying the smell of agricultural fields and distant rain. He watched cars and trucks pass on the rural highway, saw a few pedestrians moving along the sidewalks of the small town. The time Thompson spent waiting outside Johnny's roadhouse stretched and compressed in strange ways. Minutes felt like hours as he sat with his humiliation and anger, yet the entire episode would later seem to have passed in an instant. He watched the sun move lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the gravel parking lot. He listened to sounds drifting from inside the establishment, laughter and music and the clink of glasses, all the ordinary pleasures of civilian life from which he was excluded. Other people passed by during his wait. Some glanced at him curiously, seeing a uniformed soldier sitting alone outside an establishment, perhaps wondering about his story. A few looked away quickly, uncomfortable with whatever they assumed or understood about the situation. One woman, elderly and well-dressed, paused as if considering speaking to him, then shook her head sadly and continued walking. Thompson thought about the paths not taken, the choices that had led him to this particular moment. He could have stayed in Georgia, found work in the segregated economy, married and raised a family within the constraints of Jim Crow society. Many men did exactly that, building meaningful lives within a deeply unjust system, finding joy and purpose despite oppression. But Thompson had wanted something more, or something different. He had wanted to test himself, to see the world, to contribute to something larger than his individual existence. The global conflict had provided that opportunity, however complicated and contradictory it proved to be. He was serving a country that did not fully accept him, fighting for freedoms he did not fully possess, risking his life for principles that were selectively applied. Yet he did not regret his choice. The alternative was a different kind of defeat, a passive acceptance of limitation and injustice. At least in serving, he was actively engaging with the contradictions, forcing them to reveal themselves, creating evidence that could be used by future generations in their own struggles for justice. He thought about the men he had served with, the bonds formed through shared hardship and danger. Military service, even in segregated units, created a kind of equality born of mutual dependence. When a convoy was under fire, when a truck broke down in dangerous territory, when supplies had to reach desperate infantry regardless of conditions, racial distinctions mattered less than competence and courage. His fellow soldiers knew his worth, even if the broader society did not. Thompson also thought about the enemy soldiers he had encountered, though usually at a distance. He had driven past columns of German prisoners, had seen their exhaustion and defeat, had noticed their youth and ordinariness. They were not monsters or supermen, just ordinary people caught up in extraordinary circumstances, fighting for a cause that was collapsing around them. Now he was sitting outside an establishment where those former enemies ate comfortably while he was excluded. The irony was almost too bitter to comprehend. What did it say about American values that prisoners of war received better treatment than American soldiers? What did it reveal about the hierarchy of human worth that American society had constructed? These questions had no simple answers, but Thompson believed they needed to be asked persistently and publicly. The contradictions needed to be named and examined, held up to scrutiny until they became too glaring to ignore. This was part of the work of resistance, the slow accumulation of documented instances that would eventually force a reckoning. Thompson pulled out a notepad and pencil from his pack, items he carried to write letters home. He began to write, not a letter but a series of observations, a careful documentation of this moment. He noted the date, the location, the name of the establishment, the owner's words. He described the scene inside, the prisoners eating and drinking while an American soldier sat outside, unwelcome. As he wrote, he became aware of someone approaching. He looked up to see a young German prisoner, perhaps 22 or 23 years old, thin and sunburned from farm work, standing a few meters away with an uncertain expression. The prisoner spoke in heavily accented English. "Excuse me," he said. "You are soldier, yes?" Thompson nodded, his hand still holding the pencil, watching the young man with wary eyes. "I am Werner Hoffman," the prisoner continued. "I see you out here. I see what happened at door." Thompson said nothing, waiting to see where this was going, half expecting mockery or some attempt at demonstrating superiority. But Hoffman's next words surprised him. "This is not right," Hoffman said simply. "You fight for this country and they do not let you eat? We are prisoners, enemies, and we sit inside. This is not right." Thompson studied the young man's face, looking for sarcasm or cruelty, but found only genuine confusion and something that looked like shame. "It's how things are here," Thompson said, echoing Garrison's words with a bitter edge. Hoffman sat down on the bench, uninvited but not hostile, maintaining a respectful distance. "I was captured in Normandy," he said, "June of last year. My unit was surrounded. We had no ammunition, no food. We surrender. When they took us prisoner, I expect to be treated badly. We had heard stories about what Americans do to prisoners, but they gave us food, water, medical care, better treatment than our own officers gave us sometimes." He paused, looking down at his hands calloused from farm labor. "I was just conscript," he continued. "I did not want this conflict. I was studying engineering at university in Munich when they take me. I think I believe the things they tell us, about making Germany great, about enemies who want to destroy us. But when I see the things our army did in Russia, in Poland, when I see the orders we received, I start to understand we are not the heroes they say we are." Thompson listened, still wary but intrigued despite himself. This was not a conversation he had expected to have. "And now I am here. In America," Hoffman said. "I work on farm. I get paid small wage. I eat well. I am treated like human being. Better than I treated others, if I am honest. And I see you, American soldier, turned away from your own people's establishment, and I think, what kind of country is this? What are they fighting for?" Thompson let out a long breath, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "That's a question a lot of us ask ourselves," he said quietly. "We're told we're fighting for freedom and democracy. But freedom and democracy apparently have conditions attached." Hoffman nodded slowly. "In Germany we have rules too," he said. "Rules about who is acceptable, who is not. Jews, Slavs, others. I did not question these rules until I see what they lead to. I did not think about what it means to treat human beings as if they are not human. And now I sit in American establishment, eating American food, while American soldier sits outside, and I see same thing, different names." The two men sat in silence for a moment, an unlikely pair brought together by the cruel ironies of history. "What are you writing?" Hoffman asked, gesturing to the notepad. Thompson hesitated, then decided there was no harm in honesty. "I'm documenting what happened here," he said. "My unit keeps records, not official ones, but our own accounts. Someday people should know what this was like, how we served a country that didn't consider us equal citizens." Hoffman considered this. "This is important," he said. "In Germany they try to control all information, all records. They tell us what to think, what to believe. Writing truth, keeping account, this is valuable thing. This is resistance." Thompson felt something shift in his perspective. He had thought of his documentation as a personal record, a way to process his own experiences. But Hoffman was right. It was also resistance, a way of preserving truth against erasure. "Do you regret it?" Thompson asked suddenly. "Fighting for Germany?" Hoffman was quiet for a long time before answering. "I regret many things," he said finally. "I regret not asking more questions sooner. I regret following orders without thinking about what they meant. I regret the things I saw and did nothing to stop. But the conflict itself, it showed me truths I needed to learn, painful as they were." He looked at Thompson directly. "You ask if I regret fighting for my country," he said. "But was it my country I was fighting for? Or was it a regime that had taken control of my country and used it for terrible purposes? I think I was fighting for a lie, and it took losing, it took becoming prisoner for me to see the lie clearly." Thompson found himself nodding. There was a painful honesty in Hoffman's words that resonated with his own experiences. "I believe in America," Thompson said, "or I want to. I believe in what it could be, what it claims to be. But living with the gap between the claim and the reality, that's the hard part. More prisoners were emerging from the establishment now, their supervised work detail apparently ending for the evening. Several glanced at Thompson and Hoffman sitting together, surprise evident on their faces. A guard, a middle-aged corporal named Hayes, approached them. "Hoffman, time to head back," Hayes said, not unkindly. Hoffman stood, then turned back to Thompson. "I wish you could eat inside," he said. "I wish things were different. Maybe someday they will be." Thompson nodded, a small gesture of acknowledgement and farewell. As the prisoners were loaded into trucks for transport back to their camp, Thompson remained on the bench, his notepad now filled with observations and reflections. The sun was setting, painting the Kansas sky in shades of orange and purple. He was still hungry, still angry, still hurt by the rejection. But something else had been added to the mix of emotions. A strange sense of connection, an unexpected moment of human recognition across lines that were supposed to be absolute. He thought about the other soldiers in his unit, men who had similar stories of rejection and humiliation. Private Marcus Webb had been refused service at a pharmacy in Louisiana while German prisoners shopped freely. Corporal James Mitchell had been forced to give up his bus seat to a prisoner of war while traveling through Mississippi. Sergeant Robert Chen, of Chinese descent, had been mistaken for Japanese and threatened by civilians in California, despite his uniform and service record. They had shared these stories around campfires in Europe, in the brief moments of rest between supply runs. They had laughed sometimes, dark humor being their shield against despair. They had raged sometimes in the privacy of their segregated quarters, where white officers would not hear, and they had documented, keeping their own unofficial records of a conflict that was being fought on multiple fronts, not all of them acknowledged in official histories. Thompson stood up, his decision made. He would not go into another establishment and risk another rejection tonight. Instead, he would walk to the bus station, wait for the next departure, and finish his journey on an empty stomach. He had endured worse. The physical hunger was manageable. It was the other hunger, the hunger for dignity and recognition that cut deeper. But as he began walking toward the main street, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to see Hayes, the guard who had collected the prisoners, jogging to catch up with him. "Sergeant," Hayes called out. "Hold on a minute." Thompson stopped, wary, unsure what this was about. Hayes reached him, slightly out of breath. "I saw what happened earlier," he said. "At Johnny's. I'm sorry about that. It's not right." Thompson waited, expecting platitudes or empty sympathies, the kind of words that acknowledged injustice while doing nothing to address it. But Hayes surprised him. "Look," he said, "there's a diner about 3 kilometers down the road, run by a woman named Sarah Collins. She's a widow. Her son was killed in the Pacific last year. She doesn't turn away soldiers, any soldiers. I've seen her serve colored troops before. It's a small place, not fancy, but the food's good and she's decent people." He pulled out a scrap of paper and drew a quick map. "Here," he said, handing it to Thompson. "You tell her Hayes sent you. She'll take care of you." Thompson took the paper, surprised by this small act of kindness. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. Hayes looked uncomfortable, as if wrestling with thoughts he rarely put into words. "My younger brother served with the 92nd Infantry Division," he said. "Colored division, but they had some white officers. He wrote me letters about the men he served with, about how they fought and bled same as anyone. He was killed in Italy, friendly fire incident that should never have happened. Before he died, he wrote me one last letter saying he'd learned more about courage and honor from the colored soldiers in his division than from any white officer he'd ever known." Hayes's voice had gone rough with emotion. "So when I see a sergeant who served his country being turned away while prisoners eat comfortably, yeah, it bothers me," he said. "I can't fix the whole system, but I can at least point you toward a decent meal." Thompson felt a lump in his throat. These small moments of recognition, of simple human decency, were rare enough to be precious. "Thank you," he said simply. "I appreciate it." Hayes nodded, clearly uncomfortable with gratitude, and turned to leave. Then he paused and looked back. "For what it's worth," he said, "a lot of us see what's happening. A lot of us know it's wrong. Change is slow, but it's coming. Has to be." Thompson watched Hayes walk away, then looked down at the hand-drawn map. 3 kilometers was a long walk with a heavy pack, but he had walked much farther under worse conditions. He adjusted his pack and started down the road as the last light faded from the sky. The walk gave him time to think, to process the strange evening. He thought about Hoffman's words, about fighting for a lie versus fighting for a difficult truth. America was not the lie Germany had been, but it was not yet the truth it claimed to be either. It was something in between, something still being formed, still being fought over. He thought about Hayes and his brother, about the white officer who had learned to see humanity across racial lines through shared danger and sacrifice. He thought about the countless moments of recognition and connection that happened quietly, away from official policies and public declarations. Moments that accumulated like drops of water slowly wearing away stone. Sarah's diner was exactly as Hayes had described, a small white building with a hand-painted sign and lights glowing warmly in the windows. Through the glass, Thompson could see a handful of customers at scattered tables, a woman in an apron moving between them with coffee pot and notepad. He pushed open the door, the bell above jingling to announce his arrival. The conversations inside paused as heads turned to look at him. He saw the quick calculations happening in people's eyes, the assessments and judgments. Sarah Collins emerged from the kitchen, a woman in her early 50s with greying hair and tired eyes that still held warmth. She looked at Thompson, at his uniform and sergeant stripes, and something shifted in her expression. "Come in, soldier," she said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the small establishment. "Sit anywhere you like." Thompson felt tension he had not fully acknowledged begin to ease. He chose a booth near the window and set his pack down beside him. Sarah approached with a menu and a glass of water. "Hayes sent you, didn't he?" she said with a slight smile. "That man's always trying to make up for the world's wrongs one meal at a time. He said you serve all soldiers," Thompson said carefully. Sarah's expression hardened, but not with anger toward him. "My son Benjamin died on some island I can't even pronounce," she said. "He was 19 years old. His last letter home talked about the men in his unit, about how they took care of each other regardless of where they came from or what they looked like. He said that's what mattered over there, having each other's backs." She placed the menu in front of Thompson. "So yes," she said firmly, "I serve all soldiers. Anyone who has a problem with that can take their business elsewhere. Now what can I get you?" Thompson ordered meatloaf and potatoes, coffee, and a slice of pie. Simple food that suddenly represented something much larger than sustenance. When Sarah brought the meal, the portions were generous, the food hot and well prepared, served with the same care she showed all her customers. As he ate, Thompson became aware of the other diners watching him, some with curiosity, some with disapproval, some with expressions he could not quite read. One elderly man at the counter caught his eye and gave a small nod, a gesture of acknowledgement that felt like validation. A young couple at a nearby table left abruptly, the man throwing money on the table with exaggerated force, a clear statement of displeasure. Sarah watched them go without comment, then approached Thompson's table. "Some people are still fighting the last century," she said quietly. "They'll figure it out eventually, or they won't. Either way, you're welcome here." As Thompson finished his meal, another customer entered, a young white soldier, a private fresh out of basic training by the look of him. The private glanced at Thompson, did a double-take at seeing a colored sergeant, then approached his table. "Excuse me, Sergeant," the private said nervously. "I'm heading to Fort Riley. Is that where you're stationed?" Thompson nodded, surprised by the question. "I'm assigned there too," the private continued. "I was wondering if you don't mind. Could you tell me what to expect? I've never been away from home before, and I'm pretty nervous." Thompson gestured to the seat across from him, and the young private sat down, eagerly listening as Thompson shared advice about military life, about how to handle difficult training, about the importance of following orders and taking care of equipment. Sarah watched this interaction from behind the counter, and Thompson saw her wipe at her eyes with her apron. Later, when he went to pay his bill, she refused his money. "No charge for soldiers," she said firmly. "That's my rule, and I'm sticking to it." Thompson tried to insist, but she was adamant. "You want to do something for me," she said. "You write to your family when you get where you're going. You tell them you're safe and thinking of them." My Benjamin didn't always remember to write, and I'd give anything now for one more letter. Thompson promised he would, and he meant it. As he left the diner, his stomach full and his spirit somewhat restored, he encountered a sight that stopped him in his tracks. Hoffman was there, standing near the road with 2 other prisoners and their guard. They appeared to be waiting for transport back to their camp. "Sergeant Thompson," Hoffman called out, surprise evident in his voice. "You found food?" Thompson approached the group, aware of the strangeness of this encounter. "A guard named Hayes directed me to a place where I'd be welcome," he said. Hoffman smiled, genuine pleasure in his expression. "I am glad," he said. "Very glad." I have been thinking about our conversation, about the things we discussed. One of the other prisoners, an older man with corporal stripes on his uniform, spoke up in German. Hoffman translated. "Karl asks what you discussed," he said. Thompson hesitated, then decided to answer honestly. "We talked about what we're fighting for," he said, "about the difference between serving a country and serving its ideals, about the gap between what a nation claims to be and what it actually is." Hoffman translated, and Karl responded with a long statement in German. Hoffman listened, then turned to Thompson. "Karl says he was a teacher before the conflict," he explained. "He taught history and philosophy. He says every nation tells itself stories about who they are, and those stories are always partly true and partly false. The question is whether a nation can face the false parts and change them, or whether it will cling to the stories and deny reality." The guard, a different man than Hayes, checked his watch impatiently. "We need to get moving," he said, but Hoffman quickly added one more thing. "I want to thank you," he said to Thompson, "for talking with me, for treating me like human being when you had every reason not to. I will remember this." Thompson nodded, feeling again that strange connection across the vast divide of their circumstances. "I'll remember it too," he said. As the truck carrying the prisoners pulled away, Thompson stood in the darkening evening, processing the surreal nature of the past few hours. He had been rejected by his own countrymen while finding unexpected humanity in an enemy prisoner. He had been shown kindness by strangers who had no obligation to help him. He had witnessed the contradictions and complexities of a nation at conflict with itself as much as with external enemies. He pulled out his notepad again and added to his earlier observations, trying to capture not just the events, but the emotions and insights they had provoked. He wrote about Hoffman's questions, about Karl's philosophical observation, about Sarah's grief and generosity, about Hayes's quiet resistance to injustice. The bus arrived an hour later, and Thompson took his assigned seat in the back, the familiar routine of segregation reasserting itself. But something had shifted in how he experienced it. The rejection at Johnny's Roadhouse still stung, still represented a deep injustice that demanded addressing, but it was no longer the whole story. He thought about Hoffman's transformation from believer to questioner, about how defeat and captivity had opened his eyes to truths he had been conditioned to ignore. Was America not going through its own version of that process? The conflict had forced millions of colored soldiers into positions where they proved their worth, where they demonstrated courage and capability that racist ideology claimed they lacked. How long could the contradictions be maintained in the face of such evidence? Thompson reached Fort Riley 36 hours later, exhausted but thoughtful. He shared the story with his fellow soldiers in the 664th, and it spread through the colored units like wildfire. The image of German prisoners eating comfortably while American soldiers were refused service became a powerful symbol of the absurdities they endured. But Thompson also shared the rest of the story, about Hoffman and Hayes and Sarah, about the moments of connection and recognition that suggested change was possible. These stories mattered too, not as excuses for injustice, but as evidence that human decency could cross the lines that society drew. Over the following weeks, Thompson continued to document and reflect. He wrote letters to civil rights organizations detailing the experiences of colored soldiers. He encouraged other soldiers to keep their own records, to preserve their stories for a future that might be ready to hear them. The conflict in Europe ended in May of 1945, and the victory celebrations were bittersweet for Thompson and his fellow colored soldiers. They had contributed significantly to that victory, had proved themselves in every way that mattered, yet they returned to a country that still treated them as second-class citizens. But Thompson had learned something important during that strange evening in Kansas. Change came not just through grand gestures and official policies, but through countless small moments of recognition and resistance. Every time someone like Sarah chose decency over prejudice, every time someone like Hayes pointed toward justice instead of accepting injustice, every time someone like Hoffman questioned the stories they had been told, the possibility of transformation grew stronger. The prisoners of war went home eventually, Werner Hoffman among them. Years later, in 1963, Thompson received a letter from Germany. Hoffman had tracked him down through military records and the Red Cross, wanting to reconnect with the American sergeant who had shown him dignity when he had no reason to. In the letter, Hoffman described his life after the conflict. He had completed his engineering degree, had married and had children, had built a quiet life in a Germany that was grappling with its own terrible history. But he wrote that he often thought about that evening in Kansas, about the American soldier who had been rejected while prisoners were welcomed, and about how that moment had crystallized for him the nature of injustice. "I learned that day," Hoffman wrote, "that injustice wears many faces and speaks many languages. What I had accepted in Germany because it was directed at others, I recognized as wrong when I saw it directed at you. It taught me that human dignity is not divisible, that we cannot claim it for ourselves while denying it to others." He wrote that he had become involved in reconciliation efforts, working to help Germany face its past honestly and build a more just future. He wrote that the conversation with Thompson had been part of his own transformation, a moment when abstract principles became concrete and personal. Thompson wrote back, beginning a correspondence that would last for decades. They shared their experiences of post-conflict life, the challenges of readjustment, the ways their societies were changing or failing to change. They discussed the civil rights movement in America, the reconstruction of Germany, the universal struggles for justice and dignity. Thompson himself became active in the civil rights movement, using his military service as a platform to demand equal treatment. He spoke at rallies and meetings, always emphasizing that colored soldiers had earned their citizenship through service and sacrifice. He carried his wartime documentation with him, the detailed records of injustices endured and duties fulfilled, offering them as evidence when anyone questioned the legitimacy of civil rights demands. At a 1961 march in Atlanta, Thompson shared the story of Johnny's Roadhouse and Sarah's Diner with a young crowd of activists. He told them about being rejected while prisoners were welcomed, about finding unexpected humanity across enemy lines, about the guards and civilians who chose decency over prejudice. "The point isn't that some white people were kind to me," he explained to the crowd. "The point is that injustice is not inevitable. It's a choice made by individuals and institutions, and therefore it can be changed by individuals and institutions choosing differently. Every person who stands up for justice, even in small ways, contributes to that change." The story resonated particularly with younger activists who were facing their own moments of rejection and humiliation in their fight for civil rights. It became a teaching tool, an illustration of how moral clarity could emerge from the most contradictory circumstances. Years later, in 1976, Thompson was invited to speak at a university symposium on the Second World Conflict and its aftermath. Hoffman, by then a retired professor of engineering, traveled from Germany to attend. The two men, now in their late 50s, embraced like the old friends they had become. They spoke together at the symposium, sharing their interwoven stories of that evening in Kansas. They discussed how the conflict had revealed fundamental contradictions in both their societies, how defeat and victory alike had forced reckonings with uncomfortable truths. A student asked Thompson if he regretted his service, given how he had been treated. Thompson thought carefully before answering. "I don't regret serving," he said. "I regret that service was necessary, that human beings created the conditions that required such massive conflict and sacrifice. But I served because I believed in what America could become, not just what it was. And I saw evidence, even in dark moments, that transformation was possible." Hoffman added his own perspective. "I regret the cause I initially served," he said, "but I do not regret the experiences that taught me to question that cause. Without those experiences, including my encounter with Sergeant Thompson, I might have remained blind to truths I needed to see." The symposium audience, composed of students who had grown up in a different era, struggled to fully comprehend the world Thompson and Hoffman described. The institutionalized racism of 1940s America, the totalitarian control of wartime Germany, these seemed almost incomprehensibly distant to young people who had grown up with civil rights legislation and a democratized Germany. But Thompson reminded them that progress was never permanent, that each generation had to choose actively to uphold justice or allow it to erode. "The evening I spent outside Johnny's Roadhouse," he said, "I had a choice. I could have responded with violence or despair. Instead, I documented, I reflected. I connected with unexpected people in unexpected ways. Those choices mattered. They did not fix the system, but they kept alive the possibility of fixing it. He paused, looking out at the young faces before him. You will face your own moments of injustice, he continued. You will have to choose how to respond. Remember that resistance takes many forms. Sometimes it's grand public action. Sometimes it's quiet documentation. Sometimes it's simply refusing to let injustice make you less human, less capable of recognizing humanity in others. Thompson passed away in 1994, at the age of 76. At his funeral, his family displayed his wartime documentation, the notebooks filled with careful observations of injustice and resilience. They shared letters from Hoffman and dozens of other people whose lives Thompson had touched through his quiet dignity and persistent advocacy. Hoffman sent a wreath and a letter that was read at the service. Lloyd Thompson taught me, he wrote, that enemies are made, not born, and that they can be unmade through recognition of shared humanity. He showed me that dignity cannot be taken, only temporarily denied, and that grace under injustice is its own form of resistance. The world is better because he was in it, and I am better because I knew him. The legacy of that evening extended into areas Thompson could never have anticipated. In the 1980s, a documentary filmmaker researching the experiences of colored soldiers in the Second World Conflict discovered Thompson's detailed documentation in an archive. The notebooks, letters, and photographs he had carefully preserved provided unprecedented insight into the daily realities of segregated military service. The filmmaker, a young woman named Patricia Henderson, whose own grandfather had served in a segregated unit, built her documentary around Thompson's records and the stories of other colored veterans. She tracked down surviving soldiers from the 664th Quartermaster Truck Company, recording their testimonies before that generation was entirely lost to time. One of those interviews was with Marcus Webb, the soldier who had been refused service at a Louisiana pharmacy while German prisoners shopped freely. Webb, by then in his 70s, described how Thompson's documentation and advocacy had inspired him to become active in veterans' rights organizations, fighting for recognition and benefits that had been denied to colored veterans. Another interview was with the son of James Mitchell, the corporal who had been forced to give up his bus seat to a prisoner of war. Mitchell himself had passed away, but his son shared letters his father had written home describing these experiences, letters that echoed the same themes of contradiction and injustice that Thompson had documented. Henderson also traveled to Germany, where she interviewed Hoffman, by then 83 years old but still sharp and articulate. He showed her letters he had exchanged with Thompson over 4 decades, a remarkable correspondence that traced their parallel journeys from that first encounter to their eventual friendship. Hoffman described how that evening in Kansas had been a turning point in his understanding of justice and complicity. The documentary, titled Invisible Service, premiered in 1988 and won several awards. It brought Thompson's story and the broader experiences of colored soldiers to a wider audience, educating a generation that had little direct knowledge of segregated military service. Schools used it as a teaching tool, veterans organizations screened it at events, and it contributed to renewed efforts to recognize the contributions of colored soldiers to the conflict effort. Henderson interviewed Sarah Collins's daughter, who described her mother's quiet resistance to segregation, the way she had used her small establishment as a space where equality was practiced, if not proclaimed. The daughter shared stories of colored soldiers who had returned to Sarah's diner years after the conflict, bringing their families, expressing gratitude for the dignity she had shown them when dignity was in short supply. The documentary also examined the broader context of German prisoners of war in America, interviewing historians who explained how over 370,000 German prisoners had been held in camps throughout the United States during the conflict. These prisoners had generally been treated well, in accordance with international agreements, and many had worked in agriculture and industry, earning wages and living in conditions far better than Allied prisoners experienced in German camps. But the documentary highlighted the painful irony that these prisoners often received better treatment than colored American citizens, let alone colored American soldiers. Prisoners could eat in restaurants where colored soldiers could not. they could use public facilities that colored civilians were barred from. They lived without the constant fear and humiliation that characterized colored life in segregated America. This contrast was not lost on the prisoners themselves. Henderson interviewed several former German prisoners who had settled in America after the conflict, men who remembered their shock at encountering American racial segregation. One man described being in a work detail that stopped at a restaurant where he was served, while a colored guard had to wait outside. The memory had troubled him for decades, contributing to his eventual involvement in civil rights activities in his adopted country. The documentary traced how Thompson's documentation had made its way into civil rights archives, how his careful records had been cited in legal challenges to segregation, how his story had been used to illustrate the contradictions of American democracy. His work had contributed, in small but real ways, to the dismantling of legal segregation in the decades following the conflict. The story of that evening in Kansas, of the soldier rejected while prisoners were welcomed, became part of the historical record. It was taught in classrooms as an illustration of the contradictions of the wartime era, of how a nation fighting for freedom abroad maintained oppression at home. But it was also taught as a story of transformation, of how unexpected moments of connection could plant seeds that grew into lasting change. Johnny's Roadhouse, the establishment that had refused Thompson's service, closed in the 1970s. Sarah's Diner remained open until 1988, when Sarah herself passed away at age 91. In her obituary, her family mentioned that she had never charged soldiers for their meals, regardless of their background, and that she had corresponded with Thompson for over 40 years. The prisoners of war who witnessed or heard about Thompson's rejection went on to varied fates. Some, like Hoffman, used the experience as part of their own moral education. Others returned to Germany and never spoke of it. A few wrote their own accounts, adding to the historical record of that strange period when enemies were treated better than citizens. What Thompson had done outside Johnny's Roadhouse, the thing that had shocked everyone, was simply to maintain his dignity. He had not raged or despaired. He had not internalized the message that he was less worthy. Instead, he had documented, reflected, connected, and persisted. In doing so, he had demonstrated a truth that needed demonstrating, that injustice could not diminish the humanity of those it targeted, and that quiet resistance accumulated over time into irresistible force for change. The broader implications of Thompson's story extended far beyond that single evening. It illustrated how conflict can expose societal contradictions, forcing nations to confront gaps between their ideals and practices. It showed how individuals caught in unjust systems can maintain agency through documentation, connection, and dignified resistance. It demonstrated that transformation often begins in unexpected moments of recognition across lines that are supposed to be absolute. For the German prisoners who witnessed or learned of the incident, it provided an unsettling mirror. If America, the victor, the champion of freedom, could treat its own soldiers with such injustice, what did that say about universal principles of human dignity? And if they, the defeated enemies, could recognize that injustice when Americans could not, what did that say about moral clarity? These questions troubled thoughtful prisoners like Hoffman, contributing to a broader reckoning with their own complicity in worse injustices. The recognition that prejudice and dehumanization took different forms in different societies, but stemmed from similar failures of moral imagination, became part of post-conflict German education about their recent history. For colored soldiers like Thompson, the experience reinforced both their critique of American racism and their claim to American citizenship. They had served, sacrificed, and proved their worth. The fact that they were still denied basic dignity made the injustice more visible, more undeniable. When Thompson and others shared these stories with civil rights organizations, they provided powerful ammunition for arguments that military service should guarantee full citizenship rights. The story also highlighted the role of individuals like Hayes and Sarah, white Americans who chose to act against prevailing prejudices. These were not heroes in the traditional sense, just ordinary people making decent choices, but their actions mattered enormously to those who benefited from them, and they demonstrated that social change required Not just activists pushing from outside the system, but also individuals within the system choosing differently. In the decades that followed, as civil rights legislation dismantled legal segregation and as Germany confronted its history, Thompson's story remained relevant. It was cited in discussions of military desegregation, in debates about memorialization and historical memory, in educational programs about the Second World conflict's domestic impact. Historians noted that Thompson's careful documentation had preserved details that might otherwise have been lost. The names, dates, locations, and conversations he recorded provided specific evidence of how segregation functioned, how it was experienced, and how it was resisted. This specificity made the story more powerful than general statements about injustice could ever be. Thompson's correspondence with Hoffman also provided unusual insight into how former enemies could build understanding. Their letters showed two men grappling honestly with difficult histories, neither excusing nor despairing, but working toward better futures. This model of reconciliation without erasure, of honesty without hatred, offered lessons for other post-conflict societies. The Kansas evening that brought them together had been shaped by vast historical forces, by centuries of racism and totalitarianism, by global conflict and industrial mobilization. But it had also been shaped by individual choices, by Garrison's refusal and Sarah's welcome, by Hoffman's questions and Hayes's assistance, by Thompson's dignity and documentation. Those choices rippled outward in ways the choosers could not have predicted. Garrison's business eventually failed, in part because changing social attitudes made his policies increasingly unacceptable. Sarah's diner became a local institution, remembered fondly by generations of soldiers. Hayes's simple act of kindness contributed to Thompson's faith that change was possible. Hoffman's willingness to question led him toward a life of reconciliation and education. And Thompson's decision to maintain his dignity, to document rather than despair, to connect rather than condemn, created a story that would be told and retold, teaching and inspiring long after the participants were gone. The evening outside Johnny's Roadhouse became a crystallized moment, capturing the contradictions of an era when America fought for freedom abroad while maintaining oppression at home, when enemies could be treated better than citizens, when defeat could teach lessons that victory obscured. But it was also a moment of possibility, when individuals chose connection over division, when dignity persisted despite denial, when seeds of future change were planted in the most unlikely soil. Thompson understood, in the years after that evening, that transformation is never simple or complete. Progress is made and lost and made again. Injustice adapts and persists, even as it is challenged. But he also understood that every moment of recognition, every choice for decency, every act of documented resistance, contributes to an accumulating weight that eventually tips the balance toward justice. What he did outside that establishment, the thing that shocked everyone who heard about it, was to refuse to be diminished. In maintaining his humanity in the face of dehumanization, in extending understanding across enemy lines while demanding justice from his own country, in documenting carefully while hoping actively, he embodied a form of resistance that was both practical and profound. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.